welcome to the next episode of DotVVM Minutes. Today I will talk about validation and I will show you how to create beautiful forms in DotVVM and how to make sure that all the values entered by the user are valid and don't have any problems. So here's the deal. I have this page with two forms. The first on the left, it's a form for signing in, so you can enter your email and password and boom, you should be signed in. And the second is for creating a new account, so there are a little bit more fields, and of course I need to validate all those fields. Right now there is no validation, so when I click any button, basically nothing happens. The create new account will just take me to a success page. First, let's look at how our view and view model looks like. So this is the page. I am using Bootstrap, so there is the row and column for 6 columns in the Bootstrap grid system, so it's exactly 1/2. And I have two forms. First is for signing in. The second is for creating new account. And I'm using the form element because if the user is inside the form and presses the enter key, the form will look for the first submit button in the page, which is this one. So in the sign-in form, when you press enter, the sign-in button will be triggered automatically, and the same applies to create account form. It will search for the first submit button within the form. So that's what you should do if you want nice user experience in the forms. So I have the sign-in form model, which is my class. So it contains just email and password. And the first way how to validate information is to use .NET validation attributes. So the email address is required. So I can add the required attribute. And also it should be a valid email address, so I can use the email address attribute. If you want to customize the error messages, you can set parameters. So error message is equals to please enter your email, for example. If you want to localize this, you shouldn't specify this error message like this, but there is also the resource type, which is the type of your resource file, and also error message resource name, which is the key in the resource file. So if you want to localize this, then you should use these two properties. I'm good with the default error messages for the purposes of demo, and the same applies to the password. It should be required. I can also use some attributes to make sure that the password has the right complexity, but here in the sign-in form I actually don't need to do that, because if the password is too short it wouldn't be correct. Yeah, so I will fine-tune these parameters in the next in the second case for creating the account, because that's where the password is actually stored in the database. So that's it for the sign-in form. It should be like that. So we have our validation attributes in place, and let's look at the create account form. So here are more fields, but still the name should be required. Email is also required, and it should be a valid email address. Password is also required, and I can now specify either a regular expression or something else to make sure that the password contains a lot of nice characters. I think that for now we can just use min length to 8 characters or something like that. This password too, it's the confirm password field, so the user has to enter the same value as in the password field, and here it's also required. And we can use the compare attribute that says, okay, this value has to be the same as other property. So the property we are comparing to is password, so password 2 needs to be the same as this password. And there is a final property, agree with conditions, which is bound to this checkbox, and basically if the user doesn't check this field, they shouldn't be able to proceed. So we need to make sure that this has the true value. And that can be a problem because there is no suitable validation attribute for that. But you can write your own rules. And that's the second way how to do validation. So the first way are the validation attributes. The second option is to implement IValidatableObject. And it's an interface that is present in system component model data annotations. It's the same namespace from which are these attributes. These are also from this namespace. And if you implement the IValidatableObject, you need to implement the validate function, and you should return all the validation issues. This is very useful if you are doing validation and if you are happy with just values in this object. It's very difficult to look in the database in this method, so you shouldn't do it here. But if you just want to check the values, for example, make sure that the begin time of the reservation is less than the end time, or if it's in a correct range, this is the method you will need. So let's do this. If not agree with conditions, then we will return a validation result. And since this method is returning IEnumerable, you can use this syntax yield return new validation result. And let's do two things. The first is you need to agree with terms and conditions is the error message, and you can bind it to a specific property. So you can pass an array of properties that are related to this validation error. So I can do name of agree with conditions. It can be actually bound to multiple properties. For example, if you would be comparing begin time and end time, you want to bind this error message to both of the properties. Right now it's just for one property, but still this constructor requires an array, so I have to create an array with just one element. Okay, if you have more logic, you can just continue and yield return each validation problem you will find. So that's where yield return syntax is very convenient in this place. So that's the second kind of validation. You can just use attributes, or you can implement IValidatableObject and implement the validate method. And now when I click on sign in, you can see that nothing appears here, but since I'm in the debug mode, you can see this postback aborted because validation failed message. This happens only in the debug mode. When you deploy the application to the production server, the users wouldn't see this message, but they would see the page would just do nothing. So this message is actually very important for you as a developer, because it means that you need to indicate that there is some problem in the page, because otherwise the user won't see nothing. The button would just do nothing. It wouldn't send the command to the server, so you shouldn't store incorrect data in your database, but still the page wouldn't do anything. So we need to tell DotVVM how the validation should look like in this case. First, you need to tell what should happen if something is not valid. And we have several ways how to do it. First is that you can use the dot validator control, and you can say something like invalid CSS class equals is invalid, which is a bootstrap ready-made CSS class you can use. It will show everything in red. And you can say, for example, show error message text equals true, because you want to display the concrete error message. And you need to tell the validator which property you are validating. So you can say value, and you can use data binding to bind to this property. And it will read the validation state of this property from the viewmodel. So this is one way how you can approach with this. So let's try it. So we can see the email field is required, and it's not red because probably I have used a wrong CSS class. So let's fix it. Let's use text danger. The is and valid is for form fields, not for the text elements. Yeah. So now it's red, but that's not what I actually want. I would like to draw some red border around the existing element. So basically what I need to do is to add CSS class is invalid to this text box. So let's try it. So we can do two things. You can use the validator properties even without the DOT validator control. So you can use validator.invalid CSS class. It's called this kind of property is called attached property because you can use it on any HTML element or on any .vvm control. So invalid CSS class is invalid, and you can say validator.value equals email, and you need to use the data binding here. Yeah. So let's try it again, and you can see now this field is red. It contains this icon. Maybe if you hover on it with your mouse, you would like to see the error message too. So let's set another rule how the validation actually will look like. So validator.setTooltip text equals true, which means that also a tooltip would be set on this field. Yeah, so this is other way how you can do it. I prefer this. I don't like writing these messages just below the field, so I can comment this out. And so now the field is red. When I hover on it with mouse, I can see this error message. And there is third way how to display validation errors, and it's a control called ValidationSummary, which just produces a list of validation errors. And because we are in a child object, we need to tell this control that validation target is _this. This control, it's because by default this control displays the validation errors in the root view model, and it doesn't visit its child object. So if I would have some invalid property right here in the default view model, it would appear in the validation summary, but it doesn't go inside this child object in the view model. If you wanted to visit child objects, you can say include errors from children, but by default it's false because there are some performance. There can be some performance issues if your view model is really large and contains a lot of information. So that's why you need to set this explicitly. So let's try it. And you can see that this displays all the error messages in this, and this is the sign-in form. So it goes through these two properties and displays the validation errors. We want to style it so it looks a little bit nicer. So I can say class equals also alert danger, and it should make it look like a bootstrap alert. It would be even nicer if I would hide these list item bullets, but we can do it using a CSS, so I won't waste time with that. And however, what's unfortunate is that right now it displays the empty alert. So you can also tell this control to hide when valid is true. So if there are no validation errors, it would hide the entire control. And if there is at least one validation error, it will appear. So this is how you can use validation summary, for example. Okay, let's go back here to add this coloring to all the text boxes, and it would be quite inconvenient to specify this invalid CSS class and this set to tooltip text rules for every text box in the form. So what you can do is you can move these two properties. So these two properties you can move to any parent, and they will be inherited in all of their children. So let's do it. Maybe I want to be consistent in the entire application. So I can go to the master page and specify these validator rules here on the body element. That's how I will make it work the same way in the same application. So this is the global rules. And of course, you can override it with different settings here on the form level, for example, or on the page level, anywhere basically. Okay, the only thing that cannot be inherited is this validator.value, because every control will be triggered by another property in the view model. So this text box will be read if this property is not valid. And let's go then to the password. So that's what we are doing right here. So now when I try it, you can see that both fields are highlighted in red. Okay, let's work with the other form. So let's do the same thing here. So name. This is the email. Password. Password 2. And that's it. I won't use this style on the checkbox because it would look a little bit weird. And I will also put validation summary here, so it's nice and it's consistent in all forms. So now when you click on sign in, you can see that everything is validated, and that's not what we want because these are two individual separate forms. So let's show another thing you can use, and that's called validation target. Any component that can trigger this command, by default, it validates the entire view model. Yeah. So any control that is using command binding by default tries to validate everything before the command is executed. And the validation doesn't happen only on the client side, but also on the server. So if you turn off JavaScript or if you just hack out some JavaScripts that are doing the validation and succeed in sending the request to the server, still the things will be validated there. So you don't need to worry about this. Yeah, so it's validated both on the client and on the server. And by default, the entire view model is validated. If there are any validation errors, this function wouldn't be invoked at all. So you don't need to worry. Yeah, this will be invoked only if the form is valid. But in this case, I want to validate only my create account form and nothing else. So I need to set the validation target to my form. And since I am in this form, it has the data context set. So I need to validate underscore this. Yeah, it's not the entire view model. It's just this create account form. Yeah, so this is my child object and I'm in this data context. Same here. I need to use the validation target. So the button would validate only this sign-in form. Yeah, so now this button validates this and this button validates this. Yeah, so that's the validation target. Sometimes you need to make a postback and you don't want the validation at all. In that case, you can use validation.enabled equals false. Note that you are setting these two things on the control which triggers the postbacks. So don't set it on the entire form or on the entire page. Just set it on controls that are actually making some postbacks. I promise that I will show you 3 ways of how to do validation. First was the validation attributes, so that's it. The second is IValidatableObject. So let's look at the third way. I mentioned that in this validate function, there is not many ways how you can get to the database because it's not easy to pass the DB context or SQL connection here or the configuration. So you shouldn't do it. You should just validate the properties of this object if they are consistent with each other. But if you need to, for example, make sure that the user already hasn't an account there is another place where you should do it, and that's the view model, or more precisely, your business layer. Yeah, so this is just mocked up. I don't have any database in this project, and I'm not really checking the user credentials. However, if the user enters different incorrect credentials, different than this one allowed pair, I want to add additional validation error in the view model. And you can do it using the context.ModelState property. So there is the model state, and you have the errors collection, and you can add your own errors in this collection. So the first, you can add your own view model validation error. Error message is incorrect credentials and you can specify a property path. If this error is bound to some property in the view model, you can specify the name of the property, but incorrect credentials, it would have to be connected to both properties, so it's not my problem. I will not set the property path, and it means that it would be set on the validation target itself. There is also other way. If your view model is inheriting from .vvm view model base, there is an extension method add model error, where you can say I'm adding a model error on my sign in form dot email, for example, and the error message is here. So that's what you can do. However, this wouldn't work because the paths to the property must be routed by validation target. So if validation target is just this sign-in form, you have to call it on this sign-in form, but the sign-in form doesn't inherit from .vvm view model base. So this is you cannot use this method here. If the validation target is entire page, you can safely use this syntax. It's a little bit nicer. Okay. So, but this is doing the same thing, and you need to fail the request. You need to tell .vvm, okay, I have some validation errors, I cannot continue. So after setting your own errors to the model state, you should call this function fail on invalid model state. It will basically end the execution of this request by throwing an exception that is caught later inside .vvm, and that's how .vvm will see, okay, there is some validation error, so I will display it. So let's try it. So now, so this hasn't yet hit the sign-in method because there are some validation issues. So let's do this. Let's enter this email address and the password. So I will purposely enter incorrect password, so in order to my code to be triggered. So now I have clicked on sign in and nothing happens, and that's the last thing I need to do. I need to add one parameter to the validation summary. By default, validation summary only displays errors for properties of its validation target. But I haven't set the property path, so the error is not on the email or on the password property. It's directly on the sign-in form object. So I need to say include errors from target. Yeah, it's a similar behavior as include errors from children, but I will need to do this. Okay, so let's try again. And now it should work. Yeah, so you can see the error message. So if you want to pass your own error messages in the page, you need to do it in the view model, and you need to set this model state.error and fail on invalid model state. And that's the third kind of validation. So you can use attributes, you can use IValidatableObject, and if you need to check something in the database, for example, make sure that the user doesn't already exist, then you need to do it from the viewModel. And of course, in the ideal case, you would validate these things in your business layer. So you would call something like user service.signin, and this method we would probably throw an exception if there is some invalid credentials, and you would catch this exception and represent it as a model state error. So that's how you would do it in the real applications. It's very common that the business layer, your services, will just throw exceptions, and you will catch them in the viewModel and represent them in the way so they can be displayed to the user. It's also possible to write an action filter that you would apply on this method or globally to any method. And if the business layer throws an exception, you could represent this error as a validation error on the current validation target. That's same here. I'm not checking the database, but still, if the email is info@.vvm.com, I will report that the user account already exists. Yeah. So it's very similar. So when I refresh the page and try to enter this, so for example, info.vvm.com, and I will use a short password. Yeah, so I should get the min length requirement on this password. So we can see minimum length is 8. So let's use it. Then these two passwords are not the same. And now I am not agreeing with the terms and conditions. So this is the error from IValidatableObject. And when I check this, I will get another error message: the user account already exists. So when I change this email address, now I'm redirected to the success page. Yeah. So that's how we can do it. So to recap, there are 3 ways how to do validation in .vvm. First is validation attributes. The second is IValidatableObject. And the third is adding your validation errors in the viewModel individually in your viewModel code. So adding model state errors as needed and calling fail on invalid model state. And to tell .vvm how the validation should look like, you can use either the DOT validator control, which can display the error message on a place where you use this control, or you can use validation summary control, which has quite a lot of parameters you can configure. And the third way is using attached properties, so you can apply validator.value and the rules that are specified here on or any parent element will be applied to the text box. So in the master page, I have said if something is not valid, add CSS class is invalid and set the error message as a tooltip text of the element. So whenever you use validator.value attached property, these rules will be applied to the element on which you have used this property. So that's the validation in .vvm. I hope that this video was useful for you. Please leave us a message in comments, follow us on our social media, and see you next time in .vvm Minutes.